Capitulates, Opium and Good Neighbors, how Solovyov justifies the current war by rewriting the history of Britain and Europe, how Russian TV explains American-Ukrainian negotiations. In the latest episode of 60 Minutes, Russian propaganda offers viewers a coherent, yet artificially constructed narrative about the coming peace that the Donald Trump administration is allegedly imposing on Ukraine. This narrative is built on three key themes: Kyiv's inevitable territorial concessions, the deep corruption of the Ukrainian government, and the American determination to force peace. For European readers, it's important to understand the content of these assertions, what reality Russian television is attempting to present as factual. 1. The US is allegedly moving to force Ukraine to capitulate. For Solovyov, the starting point is the flight to Moscow of Trump's special negotiator, Steve Whitcoff, and his brother-in-law, Jared Kushner. The Russian viewer is told that the US is demanding territorial concessions from Ukraine and the holding of presidential elections. The negotiations in Florida were difficult, but Washington insists on a new de facto border. Trump has allegedly already refused Zelensky a personal meeting until Kyiv accepts the terms. Thus, American diplomacy is presented not as a search for compromise, but as pressure against an ally. Ukraine itself is depicted as already being placed in a dependent and humiliating position. The delegation, according to the program, sat across from the club hosts, and borscht and cabbage rolls are depicted as a symbol of persuasion through the stomach. The goal of this rhetorical move is simple: to instill the idea that Ukraine's fate is already being determined without it, and that the US is ready to strike a deal bypassing Kyiv and Europe. At the same time, the Americans are conveying to Ukraine the Russian Federation's position, which demands a complete withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from Donbass. At the meeting, the Ukrainian side argued why such an approach is impossible due to constitutional limitations, the opinion of Ukrainian society, and its inconsistency with the real situation. CNN reveals the culinary behind the scenes of the negotiations. Trump's special envoy, Whitcoff, treated the Ukrainians to borscht, which the Americans themselves described as red cabbage soup. Cabbage rolls, stuffed cabbage rolls, were also on the table. The channel concludes that Kyiv was pressured into a deal through a variety of sophisticated methods, including through the stomach. At the private Shell Bay Club, owned by the Whitcoff Group in South Florida, delegations from Washington and Kyiv sat across from each other during tough but very constructive negotiations, during which they served Ukrainian borscht, a beetroot and cabbage soup that one participant described as very rich with lots of meat. However, its serving, like that of holubtsi, traditional meat rolls wrapped in cabbage leaves, was seen as a welcoming gesture of respect for Ukrainian culture. A subtle diplomatic detail at a time when the US is trying to push Ukraine toward compromise in the peace agreement with Russia. 2. Territorial concessions are presented as a settled issue. The key idea of the episode is that Ukraine will cede territory no matter what. Quoted, Axios. Defining the actual border is supposedly the main point of the negotiations. Wall Street Journal, the dispute is over territory. Experts declaring, giving up Crimea will be painful but inevitable. CNN, on the guarantees the US is ready to offer Moscow without Kyiv's participation. The Telegraph, on the idea of deploying nuclear weapons in Ukraine as a response to territorial surrender. At the same time, Russian propaganda leads to the conclusion, if Ukraine cedes Donetsk, Russia will gain a path into the interior of the country, meaning Kyiv must resist. But if Ukraine doesn't give in, the US will increase pressure. Any scenario proposed by Solovyov leads to the same conclusion. The territory will be transferred to Russia. That's why Whitcoff is already on his way to Moscow to hand over the document on the new demarcation line. 3. Trump shows toughness, Europe shows impotence. A large part of the program is dedicated to showing the US is acting decisively, conducting 3-by-3 negotiations, switching to a closed format, demanding elections. Europe is excluded from the process and peeping through the keyhole. The EU is unable to support Ukraine and fears losing Washington. Quotes from El País, CNN, and Fox News are used, but in such a way as to create the impression the West is divided, the US dominates, the EU is demoralized. This construction is necessary for the main idea. Peace will be decided not by Brussels or even Kyiv, but by Washington and Moscow. 4. Russia is the only party ready for peace. Towards the end of the episode, Solovyov adds a rhetorical climax. Russia wants to end it, the US sees an opportunity, and Ukraine is clinging to the impossible. To reinforce this impression, they quote the former Danish ambassador, Russia will be a maximalist and will not give in. Turkish Minister Fidan, a window of opportunity will open in the coming months. Viktor Orban, if the deal falls through, Moscow will go wherever it deems necessary. This is how the final message is formed. Russia is the only rational player that wants peace, but the West and Kyiv are standing in the way. Think, analyze, draw conclusions, and don't be fooled. This was the program Empire of Lies.